Welcome to the Chain Effect Podcast, where a physical therapist and a dietitian married with 2 kids juggle the struggle of running a business, raising a family, and prioritizing our own health, all while trying to have as much fun as possible.
We are your hosts, Taylor Pope, Doctor of Physical Therapy, and
Caroline Pope, registered dietitian.
Together we own and operate a health facility bringing together physical therapists, dietitians, personal trainers, and active recovery services to create what we call the Chain Effect. Today we're talking about blood sugar. And we're talking about what I think is a revolutionary tool to help people finally make the connection and an immediate connection between what they're eating and what it's doing to their body. Mm-hmm. And it's a continuous glucose monitor, or otherwise known as a CGM. And these have become more and more popular. I mean, if you're a diabetic, surely you know about this because it helps you measure your blood glucose in real time and be able to titrate insulin to yourself and know exactly what dosage you need. But it's being used by non-diabetics to better understand their relationship with food as it relates to their blood sugar. And this metabolic functioning of your body is becoming, more widely known as maybe one of the most important things for increasing our health span and increasing our longevity. I first really took a deep dive into it after reading Peter Attia's book Outlive, where he talks about the 4 horsemen of slow death, basically cancer, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative decline, and then metabolic dysfunction, otherwise known as diabetes. And basically, we could be in a dysfunctional state, sort of laying the groundwork for those 4 horsemen of slow death for decades before they start to present themselves. Mm-hmm. And so really making changes in midlife is what's really the most important. And we haven't had a lot of tools or a lot of effective tools to really be able to understand what's going on. And a CGM is one of those tools. Mm-hmm. So we're going to dive deep into the science of this. We're going to talk at first about, what is a CGM, and then, a little bit of the science of blood sugar. And then later we're going to talk about some practical steps.
Yeah. So a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, basically estimates what your glucose level is every few minutes and keeps track of it over time. Traditional blood work, what we get in our standard panels and our annual visit, just doesn't give us enough information. I think that's why prediabetes or this metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance is not caught until later in life, or later, depending on, the symptoms people are having. So
what are those 2 major tests that they tend to?
Well, to think about insulin resistance or to kind of diagnose insulin resistance, they might look at fasting blood glucose and they might look at A1C and say, oh, if it's normal, fine. But what we're finding is A1C is really not a reliably accurate way to predict true blood sugar levels, what's going on, the variability day to day, minute to minute, based on what someone's eating. It is a 3-month average. And then the fasting blood glucose could be indicative of what you just ate last night, your quality of sleep the night before, your stress level. There's a lot of things that affect that glucose in every minute. So a CGM is an awesome way to see the connection, like you said, between what we're doing and what our blood sugar is. It's because we don't really know internally what is going on in our bodies, and it's fascinating. And metabolic dysfunction is far more common than we thought. And like you said, we can improve it with diet and exercise, but the majority of chronic diseases are rooted in metabolic dysfunction. So traditionally, CGMs are just using diabetics, insulin-dependent diabetics. You'd be surprised that I see a lot of type 2 diabetics that have never been told about CGMs by their endocrinologist or doctor, or, they've never known to ask for one. And I encourage them to get a prescription and look at that, because that can be really helpful, especially if they already have prediabetes or diabetes.
And it's just so easy, right? Because otherwise they're having to do what, finger sticks?
They just do finger pricks in the morning, but again, that's just the fasting glucose in the morning. That's not really telling you the full picture. Some people do it several times a day, but we really need to see what's going on in real time after every snack or meal.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about the technology, because I think the technology piece is why these are so powerful right now. What is a CGM and how am I able to kind of get that data?
So it has 3 parts. First, there's a little tiny sensor that can be inserted under your skin, usually the belly or the arm. I think most people are doing it in the back of the arm with a sticky patch, and it just kind of inserts. It's a little needle, inserts real quick. And then it stays in tight for the 2 weeks. It can only last about 2 weeks per sensor. They're disposable. So that's the main type that people get, especially non-diabetics. And so there's another type that it could be an implantable one that's placed inside your body. But most people and non-diabetics are getting the ones you just place behind the arm. So if you see someone walking around with a little white circle in their arm, that's a CGM. And they estimate the glucose level in the fluid between your cells, which is very similar to the glucose level in your blood. And then they have to be replaced every few weeks, depending on the sensor you have. Then it's a transmitter. So the second part of it is a transmitter that sends the information without using wires. And then the software program. So that's why you get in real time on your phone.
Yeah.
What your numbers are and the graphs. It's showing you what's going on.
And that's come a long way, even in the last couple of years. I think Libre is made by Abbott. That's like a popular one. There's another one made by Dexcom. But originally the Libre there was like a scanner in the office. So you would do the entire 2-week trial and, maybe you come back in the middle, and then they would download all the information from the CGM and then give you a readout. Hey, this is what your blood sugar did over the last 2 weeks. And then kind of align that with, what you were, what you ate or your food diary.
Yeah.
And then more recently they've had it where you had to scan. They had to wand your phone over it.
Scan under your arm or wherever the sensor is.
Exactly.
Yep.
But now the latest one is completely Bluetooth, and you don't have to do anything. And it's just reading it and sending it to your phone all the time. And it gives you alerts if if you've been away from your phone too long, but even then it stores the data until it can reestablish that connection.
Yeah. So the one downside is you do need to carry your phone around, but who doesn't these days, right?
Exactly.
It needs to be close to you, but it's super helpful and can help dietitians and health professionals a lot get that data, because we have portals we can log into, see our patients' data in real time. And so if they're logging their food, and it has a place to write notes too.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about this more next episode, part 2. But when we have our CGMs, we write notes of the food we ate. You could also do a journal with the times and as well and compare the two. But those notes are helpful. So when you see a spike or, it's flatline, you can see the note and say, oh, I had this or I had this.
But it's just to say, the application of this is just, we're right at the precipice, because, even in the less recent version, you weren't able to draw that real time connection. If you had to wait 2 weeks and then go into the office,
it's just not as effective.
You're not doing any behavior change with that. You're oh, great. Look at this data.
Yeah. And that's exactly it. I mean, technology is just wonderful around. Health technology is growing and growing. And that's one of the things. It's a great accountability tool to change behavior in the short term. And then it's a great analytical tool to develop strategies given your information you received, your results, to change your long-term health. And I know from our firsthand experience, you get kind of addicted, or we kind of would be like, oh, what did we just eat? What number is it now? I just ate this. What is this? And you can see right then. And believe me, this was the most effective thing for me to make diet changes, because I was like, what?
Yeah.
What? Okay, I'm not having that.
Yeah.
I'm not having that next time.
And we did we've done a bunch of little tests, which we're going to get into in the next episode, which are pretty hilarious between the two of us, but
everyone's different. But so a reason why a non-diabetic should use it, there's several reasons. Just like I said, the accountability factor. Also, everyone's metabolism is different, as we saw.
Yep.
And especially with males versus females, hormones with women, that affects, the way our body is reacting. Those who are more active, those who do more exercise, more strength training, but everyone is different. So I could tell 2 different patients, the same exact information. Oh, have this meal, have it in this order if you can. Let's see what that does. But their bodies could react differently. And
there's nothing really, I don't think there's been any sort of conclusive studies, but isn't there sort of a working hypothesis too that, something, our genetics, our deep coded DNA, was developed around certain foods that were available. So, based on your sort of heritage and where you came from, you might digest potatoes differently than you digest rice, but I might digest, rice and not have as big a spike from that, whereas
Yeah.
potatoes really spikes you up. So
If you're from Ireland, if your ancestors are from Ireland, I've definitely heard of that though. People are like, I do much better with potatoes. I have, Irish heritage, whereas, my spouse has this and they're not able to.
I mean, there was
digest it
that
as
book
well.
that came out in, I think it was like the late 90s, early 2000s, which was Eat Right for Your Blood Type.
Mm-hmm.
And, it had a bunch of those like ancestral sort of theories, but maybe now they have the data to be able to like make some strong research gains on that.
Yeah. And speaking of ancestry eating, I mean, I think one of the reasons what we're finding is since metabolic dysfunction is getting more and more prevalent, we think about our food supply and how that's changed from what our ancestors ate.
Mm-hmm.
And, we are at an all-time high of refined carbs, sugary, processed, bagged, boxed foods. And it doesn't have much protein in it. It doesn't have healthy fats to balance it out.
Right.
And so we've never in history had this much like accessible high fat, high carb foods without the protein levels in there as well to balance it out. So if we were hunting meat, that might be high fat, but it's got a lot of protein.
Right.
If we're doing processed packaged boxed foods, that's going to have more, these not so good fats and then a lot of carbs and a lot of sugar.
Right. And tell us a little bit about insulin and blood sugar and, what is actually happening when we eat something and then we do see that spike on the graph or we see, changes to our blood sugar. What is happening inside our bodies?
Insulin is a hormone that regulates how the body absorbs glucose. So when your pancreas, it's released from the pancreas, your pancreas detects an increase in your blood sugar level after you eat. And because all of the macronutrients can be converted into glucose actually, but carbs are the main one, of course. 100% of carbs are converted into glucose. About 58%, I believe, of proteins are converted into glucose. And then less than that of fat. So I think like only 10% of fat is actually converted to glucose. All of those things are going to create a blood sugar spike as it's digested into glucose or made into glucose. So when that level increases, beta cells in the pancreas secrete insulin hormone into the bloodstream. And then the insulin is the messenger. It tells the liver to stop making glucose at the same time because your blood has a lot of glucose in it. And insulin tells muscle cells, because primarily the glucose goes into the muscle cells, it tells the muscle cells to take glucose in. Now, it could also take glucose into the liver cells and adipose cells, but primarily it's in the muscle cells.
Okay.
And so it basically allows glucose to enter into those cells for storage.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that when we eat something, it's like supply and demand a little bit. The body obviously doesn't know when its next meal is going to happen. So we eat something, our blood sugar goes up, we have energy running through our blood, and then our body, since it's saying, okay, you have, this excess blood sugar, we got to do something with it. We either need to replenish, our muscles from activity we just did, and anything extra, we have to shuttle off to long-term storage.
Because it's dangerous for there to be glucose levels in our blood.
Right. Because what does it do? Like when there's too much blood glucose, it's got to be just like inflammatory, right? It's like an inflammatory process.
Yeah.
So when it's shuttling that extra blood glucose via insulin, where does it take it?
So it takes it into the cells for storage.
So
there's actually a glucose transporter, GLUT4, and that's embedded into the cellular membrane of these cells, and it allows glucose to go in. So when insulin is released, the GLUT4 kind of opens up. It allows glucose to go in, so it can undergo glycolysis or in the cell and be stored. So in the adipose, but also in the muscle cells or the liver cells, it could be stored in any of those sites, depending on what's going on in the body. And so it wants to store. I mean, insulin is good. It creates, it helps with tissue repair and storage, but it wants to store, especially fat in the visceral area where fat cells when insulin is high.
Yeah.
So
remind us about visceral fat though.
So visceral fat is in the midsection around our organs.
Okay.
So you might hear that. That's where it's not so healthy to have fat. It's not as much of a risk factor to have higher fat, let's say in your legs. Or that pear-shaped shape is is not as much of a health risk compared to the apple shape, which means the fat is stored more around the midsection, around the organs. So that creates more inflammation, oxidative stress, can lead to more metabolic dysfunction, disease down the road. So, but fat likes to be stored in the visceral area, when insulin is high. So basically when insulin is high, it could store fat if there's excess calories. And when insulin is high, our metabolic rate, if it stays high, our metabolic rate is going down. So we're not burning as much fuel. We're not burning as much energy. Both of those things make it harder to lose weight. We're either gaining weight or our metabolic rate is low.
What was that Petri dish experiment you were telling me about, where they had the fat cells?
I think it was fat cells in a Petri dish with fat and carbohydrate next to it.
Okay.
And so what they found is it wasn't changing size. It had this energy around it, but it wasn't changing size.
So the fat cell wasn't taking in any of the energy that was around it.
Yeah, it was just sitting there next to it. What they did was inject insulin into that fat cell or into that Petri dish. And then that opened up the floodgates, and it it created the fat cell to be expanded, like tripled in size.
Oh, wow.
And because it was storing those nutrients.
Oh, that's crazy. And that's why they call insulin like the one-way turnstile for fat to get into your cells. It's
like the fat storage hormone. So it doesn't always store fat, but if you have the right conditions, it's going to store fat, store fuel as fat.
And so it's like more insulin and also more calories.
Yeah. So fat cells grow with both increased insulin and sufficient calories. So insulin kind of stimulates the growth of fat cells, and then calories fuel the growth.
Wow.
And so you need both variables to grow the fat cells, because our fat cells, it's not the number of fat cells that make us fat. It's the growth of them.
I had heard that before. Like you have the same amount of fat cells
from when you're a child. I think you get kind of point, after a certain age, you have the same number of fat cells. It's just about the growth and size, which leads to visceral fat or fat accumulation in the body. And so
we want to
that
shrink
hormone,
those cells.
we want to shrink those cells, and we don't want insulin to be high because that increases or that decreases our metabolic rate, which means we burn less calories in a given time or given, whatever we're doing, we're still not burning as many calories in a given day. So,
that's crazy. Cause I think, we talk about people wanting, like, I have a fast metabolism. We talk about increasing metabolism, and what it sounds like is, we need our body revved up to be able to actually increase our metabolism, right? We need our body working, because if we aren't depleting the muscles of their energy storage, right, then insulin has no choice because the muscles are full, right? Muscles contain glycogen, and when we work our muscles, glycogen is released into our bloodstream as
to use for energy.
And then when we're done working out, then the food that we eat goes back to replenishing that glycogen first, right? And then when that's full, then the insulin, I guess, instructs the extra energy to go into our fat cells for long-term storage. So that's so interesting.
And that's why it's helpful to exercise after, you're eating maybe a larger carb meal, or you have a glucose spike after a meal, because it's natural to have some sort of spike. It's going to go up a little bit no matter what you eat. But then it's great to exercise after.
Yeah. And that's been so interesting too, because I've noticed, and we're going to get into like those practical steps, but I've noticed that when I exercise wearing the CGM, even if I'm fasted, boom, blood sugar spikes up a little bit. And, that is releasing, that's just a sign that my, muscles are releasing that glycogen and my liver is releasing some stuff.
Because it's not coming from food because you didn't eat anything.
That's right. And then, but what I notice after that is when it goes down, it stays down for a long time. And so, that works. So tell us about insulin resistance and what's happening there.
That's when cells are no longer taking in as much glucose. So it could be diet related, lifestyle related, but basically these glucose spikes are happening all the time throughout the day, and they're super high. I mean, there's a ton of concentrated glucose in the blood, and it's like the it's knocking on the doors of the cells, and the cells are like, hold on, no. Like, we can't take it anymore. There's too much going on. So insulin is, levels are rising to force the glucose in, but it's not working. The cells are not allowing the glucose to come in. And so the liver is still making glucose, even in the presence of glucose already in the bloodstream. Not enough insulin, there's not enough insulin in the pancreas that the pancreas can make to overcome that glucose amount. And so the plasma glucose levels could be high. That could be like the first clinical sign, or with lab tests, they're staying high, but it's hard to tell. So Peter Attia talks about it like names it the carbohydrate tolerance disorder. And that's why calorie and carb restriction is usually the best response for these patients, usually gives the best outcome for these patients to reduce insulin resistance. So preventing those spikes and the amount that insulin is having to work is going to help reduce insulin resistance, because we know this is what leads to metabolic syndrome and then diabetes.
And so, not to confuse this, but it's a good thing then if you are more sensitive to insulin.
Definitely. So insulin sensitivity is like a normal, healthy person. If they wear a CGM and their levels are very stable, that would be they're sensitive to insulin. So their cells, that means their cells are more sensitive to the insulin saying, hey, get this blood sugar out of the bloodstream and into the cells.
Okay. So yeah, that's so interesting. And I think, one of the things that I've always heard and loved is that sort of cascade of like metabolic dysfunction at the cellular level leads to metabolic dysfunction at the tissue level. And then metabolic dysfunction at the tissue level leads to metabolic dysfunction at the organ level. And then metabolic dysfunction at the organ level leads to metabolic dysfunction of the system level. Ooh. And then finally, we have symptoms, and that's usually where medical intervention begins.
Yeah, that's where they might see the doctor and be like, something's going on, I'm not feeling good. Right. And this insulin resistance increases inflammation. It increases oxidative stress. It just goes into a whole, cascade of issues. And we could pinpoint with the CGM, or if you actually knew this information that was happening inside of you, how your body was reacting to quote unquote healthy foods you thought you were ingesting, then we could stop that cascade.
Right. So powerful. It's like that long, such a struggle with nutrition is that you're balancing that long-term result with short-term gratification. Right. And what we're really doing here is we're drawing like a quick correlation between, okay, we have this short-term desire, and then this is what it's doing. And so, what more powerful tool for behavior change?
Yeah, exactly. So if your goal is to be healthy, you really need to prevent or reduce insulin resistance. And if diabetes runs in the family, that's another reason, going back to why I use a CGM. If you're non-diabetic, maybe you have healthy blood levels and your blood sugar seems fine. But if it runs in your family, or if you already carry, maybe some visceral fat or something, you should see what's going on in your body and how it's reacting to your current intake and make changes as needed.
Okay, so I have the CGM and I have my graph, and I'm looking at my graph every day. What should I be looking for? Like, what is good and what is bad?
So on the graph, I kind of describe it as, instead of these huge spikes and drops, you want it to look more like rolling hills. And it's going to rise naturally, like I said, especially with a meal that's balanced and it has maybe some starchy vegetables or some whole grains, but you've also got some protein and fat and vegetables in there. But we really want to see rolling hills so that it's not these big spikes and then drops. So poor metabolic function would be huge spikes or prolonged spikes after you eat. That means your insulin's not really...
like a plateau?
It's kind of like it's stuck up there. That means your insulin's not really... or maybe your cells are not as sensitive to insulin. So prolonged spikes, big spikes and big drops, and then high variability throughout the day. So that means like high highs and low lows. So it's dropping super low, going really high, and then high levels in the morning consistently. Could be showing you, okay, maybe what you're eating late at night is affecting that. Maybe it's your sleep, maybe it's your stress. And this is where other factors come into play, where you really need to work on stress management, which can affect our blood sugar levels. Really want to work on our quality of sleep, which affects it as well. But it could be your cells are not as insulin sensitive and you're getting a little bit of insulin resistance. in there. So that's what you kind of want to look for. So our goal is minimal blood sugar rise after meals, low variability at any time during the day, not going too high or not going too low.
All right. So that is an awesome overview of CGMs, what they are, what they're measuring, and kind of the sort of inner workings of our body as it relates to blood sugar. But how can we, like, now that we have this data, now that we know what we're looking at on the graph, what do we do with it? How do we use this? How do we apply it?
Well, that is what we're going to go over next episode. Stay tuned for part 2. We're going to talk about practical applications, what we can do to combat metabolic dysfunction, and our personal experiences wearing the CGMs, because we have a lot of stories about that.
Yeah, that's going to be awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. And stay tuned for the next episode, and we'll catch you later.
All right. Catch you on the flip side.